The topic that I was assigned to is the effects of cocaine on the brain. Topic overview. What neurotransmitters are affected by cocaine? What is the function of the neurotransmitters that are affected by cocaine? What parts of the brain is the most affected by cocaine? What is the overall result of the parts of the brain that are affected, and how does this lead to addiction? The affected neurotransmitters. Cocaine affects many of the neurotransmitters. Here are some of the neurotransmitters that are affected: dopamine, norepinephrine, serotonin. Dopamine controls the reward and pleasure center of the brain. Now I will play a video.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I simplistically explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss the effects of cocaine on the brain. Cocaine is a strong stimulant that can cause a range of effects, including increased energy, alertness, and euphoria, along with an elevated heart rate and other sympathetic nervous system responses. Cocaine also has a high potential for abuse and inclines users towards compulsive administration of the drug. Although all the details of how cocaine produces its effects are not known, it is thought that the main mechanism by which cocaine acts on the brain is through the inhibition of the reuptake of neurotransmitters called monoamines. Monoamines are a group of neurotransmitters that includes dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin. Reuptake is a method of removing neurotransmitters from the synaptic cleft between neurons. When reuptake is inhibited, it causes increased levels of neurotransmitters in the synaptic cleft. Cocaine inhibits reuptake by blocking the action of the proteins known as transporters that are normally responsible for it. By blocking monoamine transporters and inhibiting monoamine reuptake, cocaine causes levels of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin to increase in the brain, enhancing the activity of these neurotransmitters at their receptors. Although cocaine increases levels of dopamine, norepinephrine, and serotonin, it is not very clear what the individual contribution of each of these neurotransmitters is to the effects of the drug. However, it is generally thought that cocaine's action at dopamine receptors is most important for making cocaine rewarding and promoting the compulsive use of the drug. The mesocortical and mesolimbic dopamine pathways, which are sometimes called the mesocorticolimbic dopamine pathway, are pathways that are rich in dopamine neurons. They project from a dopamine-rich region in the brainstem called the ventral tegmental area to a variety of locations in the limbic system and frontal cortex. These areas include a region called the nucleus accumbens, which is considered important to addiction and is activated whenever we do something rewarding. Thus, when someone uses cocaine, dopamine activity along the mesocorticolimbic pathway is increased, causing dopamine levels to rise in regions like the nucleus accumbens.
The function of the neurotransmitters that are affected. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter that is released by the brain, in which plays numerous roles for the function of the body. So what are affected is the movement, memory, pleasurable reward. Norepinephrine is the neurotransmitter that deals with stress. The function that affected is your heart. Functions that are affected is your heart beats faster. Serotonin. The function of the serotonin neurotransmitter is to reduce stress, regulate anxiety, heals wounds, less anxious, and more emotionally stable. Cocaine blocks the reuptake by blocking the dopamine transporter, which means cocaine causes dopamine buildup, which that's when in cocaine, that's where you get that pleasurable reward and you get that high energy. The parts of the brain that are affected most by cocaine. Affects the dopamine and the dopamine receptors. Cocaine produces large amount of surges of dopamine. Limbic system is affected. Cocaine's initial effect is dopamine buildup, like I said. Results of the parts that are affected. Euphoric, paranoid, impulsive, talkative, how addiction starts with cocaine. And now I will play a video.
Addiction is a neurological disorder that affects the reward system in the brain. In a healthy person, the reward system reinforces important behaviors that are essential for survival, such as eating, drinking, sex, and social interaction. For example, the reward system ensures that you reach for food when you are hungry because you know that after eating you will feel good. In other words, it makes the activity of eating pleasurable and memorable, so you would want to do it again and again whenever you feel hungry. Drugs of abuse hijack this system, turning the person's natural needs into drug needs. The brain consists of billions of neurons, or nerve cells, which communicate via chemical messages, or neurotransmitters. When a neuron is sufficiently stimulated, an electrical impulse called an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal. Here it triggers the release of a neurotransmitter into the synaptic cleft, a space between neurons. The neurotransmitter then binds to a receptor on a neighboring neuron, generating a signal in it, thereby transmitting the information to that neuron. The major reward pathways involve transmission of the neurotransmitter dopamine from the ventral tegmental area, the VTA, of the midbrain to the limbic system and the frontal cortex. Engaging in enjoyable activities generates action potentials in dopamine-producing neurons of the VTA. This causes dopamine release from the neurons into the synaptic space. Dopamine then binds to and stimulates dopamine receptor on the receiving neuron. This stimulation by dopamine is believed to produce the pleasurable feelings or rewarding effects. Dopamine molecules are then removed from the synaptic space and transported back into the transmitting neuron by a special protein called dopamine transporter. Most drugs of abuse increase the level of dopamine in the reward pathway. Some drugs such as alcohol, heroin, and nicotine indirectly excite the dopamine-producing neurons in the VTA so that they generate more action potentials. Cocaine acts at the nerve terminal. It binds to dopamine transporter and blocks the reuptake of dopamine. Methamphetamine, a psychostimulant, acts similarly to cocaine in blocking dopamine removal. In addition, it can enter the neuron into the dopamine-containing vesicles, where it triggers dopamine release even in the absence of action potentials. Different drugs act in different ways, but the common outcome is that dopamine builds up in the synapse to a much greater amount than normal. This causes a continuous stimulation, maybe overstimulation of receiving neurons, and is responsible for prolonged and intense euphoria experienced by drug users. Repeated exposure to dopamine surges caused by drugs eventually desensitizes the reward system. The system is no longer responsive to everyday stimuli. The only thing that is rewarding is the drug. That is how drugs change the person's life priority. After some time, even the drug loses its ability to reward, and higher doses are required to achieve the rewarding effect. This ultimately leads to drug overdose.
Cocaine increases the amount of norepinephrine, which controls the body flight or fight response. Hence the following effects of cocaine: increased blood pressure, increased body temperature, increased heart rate, increased rate of respiration. Cocaine is a highly addictive drug that ups your levels of alertness, attention, and energy. In addition, although cocaine blocks dopamine chemicals in the synapse, after a period of time, the dopamine breaks down Now the stock of dopamine needs to be replenished, otherwise the user will feel depressed and low. The natural process of dopamine replenishment takes time. As a result, the user starts craving the drug. This is how addiction starts. And these are my sources: The Brain, Healthline.com, drugabuse.gov, ultimaterecovery.com, ncbi.gov, and google.com for the picture on slide 6.